Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the fifth and final webinar of the fifth round of the People's Migration Challenge. Thank you so much for joining us, and good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. We're very pleased to have people from time zones around the globe. Today, we will be talking about climate change and migration. But before that, I just want to mention that with International Migrants Day coming up on Friday, December 17th, and going into the 18th, at least in some time zones, we will also be having a series of panels with some cultural events as well, all online. And I encourage everybody also to participate in these. I'm not sure whether I have forgotten any other of the introductory messages, but if I have, one of the other co-organizers will remind me and I will loop back to them before we finish. So I want to welcome you today to our climate change and migration panel. This builds upon three online and one social media previous round. And the three very, very esteemed panelists will be reflecting upon the discussions that we've had and the write-ups of the discussions that we've had from those previous rounds. Just to remind you of some of the main outcomes and some of the main questions. We'll be going back to some key messages. These are first, that climate change is exacerbating existing inequalities. That we need to include climate change and DRR experts when we discuss migration and development. That people migrating in the context of climate change must be involved in the development of the policies that affect them and provided with the support that they need. Particularly, it's important to engage with women and those women who are rarely given a voice but have a ton of knowledge and may also be displaced or at high risk of displacement. And then that we need to take account of the climate grief that is facing people who have been displaced and people who are at risk of displacement, and the kinds of intangible, existential but intangible losses. What in climate action is sometimes referred to as non-economic losses, but they have all kinds of effects and need to be recalled. So we're also drawing on the previous discussion, the one-page document that we came up with after our second discussion, I don't know, about 5 or 6 months ago, reflecting some priorities. And that's, again, climate change exacerbating pre-existing structural inequalities, causing damage, particularly in climate vulnerable countries of the global south. It's the importance of working with local authorities and getting resources to the local level. So we can ask our representatives of national governments how this can be done, how civil society and other stakeholders can facilitate this. Again, the importance of ensuring women's participation and agency. Seeking concrete ways to mainstream the concerns, needs, and participation of women, especially poor women, women in agricultural and domestic work, both those at risk of displacement and those who have migrated or been displaced. And then migration as adaptation depends on context and support. Whether people who are impacted view migration as adaptation depends on context and circumstances, and whether there is support for them to stay and support if they want to move, for them to do so before they are obliged to move or forcibly displaced. And this is really sort of at the heart of our discussion today of bringing together migration policy and climate policy from the global forums. We're coming out of COP26 and we're going into the first International Migration Review Forum of the Global Compact for Migration. And what do we need to do where, and how can we get these two together? National level action, cooperation with civil society, regional level solutions, global solutions. How do we make progress? And then related to this, finance is a really big issue. Resources are a really big issue. Getting finance and support to national and especially local level where people need it. So that's just a quick review of some of the key messages that have come out of our previous discussions and what we're going to take into our discussion today with our three panelists. So we're going to do this in 2 rounds, and I'd ask each panelist to speak for 5 or 6 minutes in this first round to address speak to their reflections on these messages. And I'll introduce our first panelist without further ado. Ambassador Nazrul Islam is Ambassador of Bangladesh to Ethiopia, Sudan, South Sudan, and Burundi, and to the African Union. He was previously Director General in the Foreign Ministry of Bangladesh, in charge of the Multilateral Economic Affairs Wing, which also includes migration. He was Deputy Permanent Representative in Geneva for almost 8 years. He's a career diplomat in the Bangladesh Civil Service and has a distinguished diplomatic career in various capacities in Bangladesh missions in Rome, Kolkata, and Geneva. While at the headquarters in Dhaka, he worked in various capacities in different wings. So we have someone from one of the most climate affected countries serving as representative to countries in another region, East Africa and the Horn of Africa, IGAD, that is also extremely affected by adverse impacts of climate change. But both Bangladesh and the IGAD region also have been leaders in developing policies to address the impacts of climate change on human mobility and to avert, minimize, and address displacement. So since I will introduce each speaker just before they speak, I would ask Ambassador Islam to please turn on your camera and microphone and share your reflections with us. Thank you.
So, thank you very much, Evelyn. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. So I'm Nazrul Islam. I am currently now in Addis Ababa. So first, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Migration Forum Asia for organizing this event and also inviting me. So I have a small experience of around 27 years in foreign service, especially dealing with migration. So I'll be very frank, since I hope that you would also understand me, that whenever we talked about migration, so it always carried a negative connotation in the multilateral fora or in international platforms. Even like today, we are discussing climate change and migration. It has an air that migration is not a good thing. So, but we have to think that migration has been a historical phenomenon. I mean, from time immemorial. Even without climate change, we had migration. And because the world does not have the resources equally shared in every place, so whether we have climate change or not, we had migration. But the climate change has just, made it worse. I will pick up the case of Bangladesh, because Bangladesh has a population of 165 million, and it is one of the top 7 countries adversely impacted by climate change. And our 2/3 of the landmass is actually within the 5 meter of sea level. And our 28% of the population, they live on the coast. And this way, if the present rate of sea level rise continues, by 2050, 1 in every 7 Bangladeshis will be a climate migrant. And by 2050, we may lose around 11% of our total landmass. And we may also have 15 million climate migrants all over Bangladesh. So you understand the situation. And we are only discussing, we in many international platforms, we only discuss about the immediate impact of climate change, about the displacement and the migration. But often we forget to take into account the security aspect and the human rights aspect of this climate-induced migration and displacement. Because it is not only the displacement or migration itself, the impact of even this displacement or migration is also enormous for any country or even a region. So I will also actually ask everyone to think not only about the migration itself, also the impact that this migration causes for a country or for a population. So the security aspect and the human rights aspect is also very important when we discuss the climate-induced migration. And from Bangladesh, we think that since this climate change is a global issue, so this climate-induced migration is also a global issue. And this must be considered from the angle of humanitarian and development aspects. So this cannot be only as a scientific issue. So this must be actually handled in such a way that other humanitarian and development issues are considered and managed. So climate change induced migration must also be considered in the same way. And I'm happy that previously we had very negative uh, connotation or some adverse reactions from many developed countries, but probably the things are changing. And one important development I may mention recently is that we have one special rapporteur created only for climate change in Geneva under OICHR. And this has been actually an agreement among the countries. It was an unanimous decision. So which also actually mentions that people are more or less coming into terms with the adverse impact of migration induced by the climate change. So I think we also need to coordinate among the platforms. We need a lot of platforms, like we have Nikki, we have PDD, only dealing with climate-induced migration. But also there are other platforms, so we should not think in silos. Like Evelyn, you mentioned IMRF, that is coming probably next year. So we must also push forward not only migration itself, also climate-induced migration, along with other aspects of migration. So for the time being, I'm stopping, then I'll come back again. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that got us off to a great start, Mr. Islam. And in fact, you provided an excellent set of issues to address and segue to our next speaker, Mr. Anil Nikila, the Deputy Permanent Representative from the mission of Fiji to the UN in Geneva. And Fiji in Geneva has been exceptionally involved in some of these discussions, including as president of the Human Rights Council and in leadership of the platform on disaster displacement. So hopefully can help us further along this discussion of coherence across the silos, as you mentioned. Mr. Anil Nikila is the Deputy Permanent Representative of the Permanent Mission of the Republic of Fiji to the UN and to other international organizations in Geneva. And he was the former Director of the National Disaster Management Office in the government of Fiji. So he has both capital and Geneva perspectives on this, the PDD experience, and look forward to hearing what you have to say, sir. It is your floor for 5 or 6 minutes in this first round, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Evelyn. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Thank you very much, Evelyn. I think in the discussions for today, when we look at the context of the discussions that happened earlier, one of the things that from the perspective of Fiji, that is very important is that climate change and looking at migration and displacement is that for us, this is an existential threat. I think a lot of what has been shared early speaks to the heart of what we have been saying. For example, when you look at climate change exacerbating the existing inequalities, and when we look at the threat of migration across the spectrum of countries in the region, in the world, I think this is the reality that we need to look at. But in terms of looking at some of the salient points for discussions that we have had in terms of looking at this in the context of the Pacific, for us, one of the things that we advocate for in PDD is trying to address the root causes for some of these issues. I think for us as a small island states, the issue of migration, in terms of looking at it in terms of climate change, basically means moving over cross-border, or also looking at human mobility in the context of these discussions. But for us, in terms of for Fiji, I think we have taken a very proactive approach in terms of looking at how we can address some of the underlying factors. For us, one of the things that we normally face frequently is flooding. And when we look at it in the context of urban areas, we know that this is something that we need to work on to address migration. So for example, in terms of looking at the impacts, for us, the government has also tried to ensure that we have programs in place to look at addressing one of the biggest issues, which is the rights of displaced person. And that is basically looking at providing a land tenure systems that provide security for those people that will be highly likely to be displaced. And that is something that is very core to the work that we do in terms of looking at working with local authorities, and also in terms of financing. I think financing is one of the critical components when we look at the work of states or governments in terms of working together with civil society and NGOs. I think one of the things that we have tried to work on in Fiji is to avoid crowding out the involvement of private civil society and NGOs in the work that we do. I think in most instances, we are sometimes seen to be competing for the same funds with the civil society and NGOs, but to ensure that we work coherently in terms of addressing this, there's a need for us to support each other. So in Fiji, we look at the plans that CSOs and NGOs have, and we work together to advocate for donors, to support the work of CSOs in where it complements the work of government. We fully understand that government cannot do this alone. And we have certain skills, or in sometimes certain capacities with CSOs and NGOs that can help the work of government. So we look at it holistically in terms of how we can work together in terms of securing funds to allow CSOs and NGOs to operate, to support the work of government in doing advocacy work, in terms of looking at the rights of women, looking at disability, and also in terms of working with government and advocating some of the views of government and plans of government in terms of trying to ensure that we address the root causes around disaster displacement, and also in terms of looking at in the various contexts like NGOs, and also like in urban areas, and also in terms of working with rural areas. But I think one of the areas too that is very important is the role of women. I think in terms of looking at this is very important. For us in Fiji, we have done almost 6 relocation projects, whole of community relocation. But one of the things that we have noted is the important role that women plays. Inclusive policies on IDP have the gender element embedded. But when we look back at that relocation experience, we note how the implementation of the relocation program is framed around the role of women and how women see this as a very important step. For example, when we look at it from alternative livelihoods, we note that women have a lot of interest in alternative livelihoods, things that sustain the community, that is very important in their survival in their new areas. And also when you look at housing and shelter, there's certain elements that come into places when we look at the kitchen. Sometimes we prefer planning to be around the use of firewood, but when we have the element of women involved, they come up with ideas on cook stoves, in terms of lighting, the use of solar, things which help them more in terms of looking at it in the context of the community. One of the areas that we normally discuss is around safe spaces. For example, the use of community halls as part of the relocation plans. For us in relocation, in terms of looking at community halls, it's just for meetings. But for women, they look at it as in the perspective of traditional knowledge, how they can transfer that to boys and girls in the community, how they use that space in terms of childhood education, like kindergartens. Those are some of the things that is very important in terms of looking at this dimension. And most importantly is the location of new settlements. While we go for those that might be low of risks, but we look at it in the perspective of women in terms of access to public transportation, and also in terms of the proximity to market. So in terms of looking at some of the experiences that we have in terms of addressing migration, we have noted that the role of women is very central to a lot of the discussions that we are having. And in terms of shaping the way we implement some of these plans are framed around the way women perceive of the women's perspective in relation to the future of some of the discussions that I've mentioned. So I'll end it there, Evelyn, in terms of the preliminary round for these discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate your comments. And thank you both for sticking to time. I think this means we'll be able to get through both rounds, maybe a third round, but certainly also a lot of questions from the floor, which is always important to get new perspectives in. So now we will go to our third panelist, who is not actually the representative of a national government, but has a great deal of experience with representatives of national governments working on regional processes as well as at the global level. Ms. Dina Ionesco just joined the UNFCCC, that's the UN Climate Change Secretariat, she joined the Secretariat of UN Climate Change as a senior advisor in the Adaptation Division with a focus on non-regional groups and facilitating partnership with the Climate Vulnerable Forum and enhancing the focus on human mobility and other cross-cutting issues. As many of you know, Dina has long experience on climate change and human mobility. Over the past decade, she spearheaded the work on migration and climate change at IOM, establishing the first ever UN Migration, Environment and Climate Change focused division, MEC, IOM's first environmental sustainability program, and she led the thematic contributions for the Paris Agreement and the Global Compact for Migration, and developed numerous programs and projects in her leadership of MEC. And she's the author of numerous publications, including in the Atlas of Environmental Migration. Before that, she also worked at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD. So we're very privileged to have Dina in one of her first public appearances, I believe, in her new role. She's long talked about getting climate in migration and migration in climate, getting beyond these silos. So I'm hoping that, Dina, you will build on the very useful contributions of our first two panelists and take us forward with some ideas, maybe talk a little bit about what you want to do in working with the Climate Vulnerable Forum and how this is relevant to those. This is a mainly migration focused audience, I think. How can we get beyond these silos, and how can stakeholders and governments work more effectively together? Dina, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Evelyn, and hello, everyone. And indeed, I feel it's me who is very privileged to be invited, because I just formalized this new function and move. And so I feel a bit strange to it's like on the other side of the coin after being obsessive about climate change in a migration organization to become a bit obsessive about maybe human mobility in a climate one. So I think from my perspective, for this meeting today, I think what's key, of course, and at the heart of absolutely everything that we raised today, it's the connection between the national, regional, international, also private sector with, in fact, civil society, with people affected, with the people on the ground through clear action and inclusiveness. And I think that's the biggest question of what mechanisms exist. To start the discussion from my side, I was thinking just to say a few words about this international vision somehow, because I think having worked in intergovernmental organization, I've been always exposed to working with different groups of states and with champion states. So we have today Bangladesh and Fiji, who are champion states of bringing migration into the discussion on climate change and on climate change agenda to better think of migration issues. What I find very striking as an international change over the past 15 years, it's really how much the road has been long, but we integrated now. We have anchorage in all key texts about migration and climate change and this nexus and the connection, which means that you have somehow the anchorage to overcome the silos. So there is awareness about the silos, and there has been a big change to have so much migration, for instance, integrated in the SDGs, in the Paris Agreement, in the Sendai framework, to have migration and climate change spoken about in the Land and Desertification Convention, in the human rights whole agenda, in the humanitarian world. So this was not the case, in fact, 15 years ago. So I think we have to really acknowledge that there is a change of awareness. And when you are in an international organization, I think you see how much integrating in other agendas your topic means you in somehow sign for doing absolutely everything in partnerships, because it can't be done differently. It has to go through partnerships. So I think the complexity of what we are at hand is that we can add layers and layers. You can say migration, climate change, development, and women, and youth, and gender issues, and health, and food security. So we have no choice but to address in connection all these topics, while also being everyone has to do its job in its own space and its own work in partnership with the others. That was my first point, more on the international vision I see for this topic. And that the question now, it's again, we anchored all this in this main text. Now it's a question of implementation and accelerating action, I think. And the second thing I wanted to mention maybe as a start, and that's cross-cutting your questions a bit, Evelyn, and about what both speakers have mentioned before, it's maybe to come just a little back to COP26 and to Glasgow and what has happened on migration, human mobility, that can be of interest also for action. I feel that very often after COPs, there's like a post-COP depression time where everyone is like, it's not enough, it's not what we wanted, and it's normal. But it's also maybe a bit denial of what a process that's a very long-term process can bring in just one event. So I looked a bit on across what has come out of the Glasgow meeting and picked up quite a number of very interesting points about migration and climate change that all connect to the one pager that you shared with all of us for this meeting. So for instance, first, I would say the Glasgow Declaration speaks of migrants' rights. It's aligned to Paris Agreement text, nothing new, but it's there. So for absolutely everyone who wants to make a point, it's there. It's a strong entry door and anchorage that connects also with what has been told about, for instance, the new special envoy on climate change and human rights. Then second, in the loss and damage and Warsaw documents and decisions, there's a follow-up, a continuation of the work. So the work of the Task Force on Displacement is recognized. The work of the human mobility track of the Warsaw Mechanism on loss and damage 5-year work plan is recognized and continued. And there's the very important also operationalization of the Santiago network, which I think it's now a very good space. And we have examples of, for instance, the Norwegian supporting now through the platform on disaster displacement and other partners, the further operationalization of capacities for the Santiago network, which are in line with everything that's going on in the Warsaw Mechanism on loss and damage, on insurance, on human mobility, on slow onset. A third thing that I find extremely interesting, and that it's at the core of absolutely what's on your card for the summary card, it's the local level, the city level. At COP, there has been amazing advance from cities, from mayors, and I would have really highlight the whole investment of the Mayors Migration Council, of the C40 also initiative, of the support of foundations to this whole strong agenda on migration and climate change. That's, for me, I think, maybe the area where there's the most of advances. Fourth area, I would say also the climate vulnerable countries, the climate vulnerable forum. I think it's very important to follow what the climate vulnerable forum has presented at the COP. In particular, the Glasgow DACA declaration, that it's also recognizing migration and displacement dimensions, and that connects to also the climate prosperity plans promoted by the chairmanship of the climate vulnerable forum. So there are quite a number of elements like this, also finance, to look at finance and alternative ways of finance also for loss and damage. It's there, but you have to look at them and showcase them. And then I would say also the recognition of the role of youth and original entry points, like the recognition of oceans for the first time very strongly in all the outcome documents of this COP. And there's a lot to consider on migration, human mobility in relation to ocean acidification, sea level rise, coastal erosion. So for me, these 2 points, I wanted to kick off the discussion from my side with this international side, and then a perspective from the COP26, because it responds also to what you are saying about the connection with other agendas. Now we move from the COP and looking at how migration features in climate change action to the IMRF, to the Migration Forum, and where it's really about migration innovation in the domain of migration policy and practice. So the connection is there. It's about addressing through climate action, addressing the negative drivers and that affect human mobility. So it is about climate action to curb future displacement and forced form of migration, but it's the IMRF, it's also and mainly about the change in migration thinking, the regular pathways, how much labor migration, how much diaspora policies, how much visa issues can be also part of the solution. So that I stop here for this first round. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dina. That was also extremely helpful. We really have a lot of material to work with. So I'm going to pick up on a couple of threads that I think were in each speaker's comments in the first round, as well as things that are sort of central to the conversations that we've had in the People's Migration Challenge, especially in the climate, but also in some of the other topical discussions on some of the other priority issues, including regularization and regular pathways, recognizing that migrants who are obliged to cross borders in the context of disasters and climate change may not always be able to do so, that we don't right now have the regular pathways that entitle climate displaced people to cross borders or to get a regular status. They may not be admitted. We don't have the visa programs that we might want, that are suggested as important policy actions, for instance, in Objective 5 of the Global Compact for Migration. So I want to park that there for all three of our panelists. But then also, you all mentioned human rights. I think each of you actually mentioned the new special rapporteur on climate change and human rights, or maybe it's human rights and climate change. But beyond that important role, if you have thoughts on how mobility might be incorporated into that mandate, I'd sort of welcome those. I think that's part of overcoming the silos, but that one person, whoever she or he may be, and I hope we get a really good person, is going to have many, many issues to address. But human rights is also, as you mentioned, I think Dina mentioned, in the Paris Agreement, it is a guiding principle of the Global Compact for Migration, as is gender responsiveness. But how are we going to get human rights, make human rights a guiding principle of implementation at the national level of policies to address adverse drivers? They could be in the context of GCM implementation, but also climate action and humanitarian strategies and disaster risk reduction. How are we going to get human rights, or ensure that human rights is the guiding principle in addressing drivers, and that human rights is also a guiding principle in the formulation of policies towards cross-border migrants, towards making regular pathways available to those who need them? I'm hoping for some specifics. I think this time we might go in reverse order, if that's okay. No, okay, Dina.
No.
You
we
look
can.
a little bit shocked there.
No, I was joking. You do as you want. So
okay, we'll go we'll go back to you for just a couple of minutes. Maybe you can answer that question, and then we'll also do a short third round after we get some input from others.
Yes. Okay. No, thank you. I was joking, but no, what I find it's extremely important when we speak about migration is that it's in fact, we speak about so many different realities behind the work. So we have, I think, to be extremely careful about this, and that unpacking this migration whole definition nexus helps in a way respond to your question. In my view, it's key to also make the difference between the internal and international dimensions, and then at internal level to make also then go into all the nuances of what we know about different types of migration that are internal. So of course, the internal displacement and the rights of IDPs and situation of displacement related to disaster or to slow onset also situation, I think it's a very particular dimension. There you have different all human rights that matter, the rights to housing, to health, to education. All the array of human rights will be key. And I really think that it's very important to then look also at for instance, the action that Cecilia Jimenez, as the special rapporteur for the rights of IDPs, has also pushed for more visibility on the slow onset dimension and IDPs. I find that the report, it's very important to showcase this. And then it's all also issues of internal migration, that it's seasonal, and what we saw with the impact of COVID that has broken patterns of internal migration that's seasonal and exposed again the most vulnerable. It's again a question of development and of rights. And of planning. And then you have also the situation of internal migration, that it's also related to the nomadic population. And of course, there's the whole issue of the question of urban movements and rural to urban movements. So, but there for me, the framework of human rights, it's absolutely key and clear, and provides all these insights on unpacking, in fact, the human rights and what are also the obligation of states according to each stage of the disaster. What can be done before, during, and after? We saw, for instance, how much there's increase in trafficking in people after a disaster situation. And then there's the international world around all the cross-border questions related to disaster or to slow onset, where we enter again the world of migration policy and practice, and where the most advances we saw over the past year at a regional level. So you have, of course, the example of the Pacific, and there are excellent now programs ongoing in the Pacific, developing new thinking and frameworks, and where the Pacific leaders are taking the leadership on the discussion at framing the discussion at regional level. But you have the example also of Eastern Africa, the free movement protocol of IGAD that has now recognized disaster and environmental and climate issues. You have West Africa projects, you have projects in Southern Africa, you have projects in the Caribbean, in Central America. So I think the regional consultative processes on migration are spaces where this reflection on protection, on policies, on visas, it's maybe the ones advancing most at international level. And to conclude, just I would say at international level, of course, again, the human rights are key, in particular also non-refoulement, the right of non-refoulement, and there are a lot of thinking going on there about thresholds, habitability, the action of the country, that it's a country of origin. There's so much thinking ongoing about what kind of status, what kind of policies can be supportive of people moving in the context of climate change. And the GCM frames this very much by saying, in a way, we recognize the environmental drivers, but we need bigger comprehensive migration policies to be able, in fact, to address the issues. And this includes also labor migration, for instance, or diaspora policies or consular. It can be very concrete and broad migration policy thinking. So for me to respond to this first question, I would just, yes, it's the connection between the internal and international dynamics that to make the difference, but also, of course, to connect. Because the two are totally connected. But I stop here.
Thank you very much, Dina. I think that sets us up perfectly to hear from our other panelists. I think that going back to Anil Nikila, I will add the additional GCM guiding principle of international cooperation that's also in Objective 23, and connect this. How can rights be protected? How can the rights of people who've been displaced or are at displacement risk be protected? How can states fulfill their obligations if they don't have the resources to do so? That gets us back to the question of international cooperation, of the need for finance. How can international cooperation in terms of resources help countries to meet their human rights obligations, to work together within regions? What are some of the kind of leading ideas that are being developed in your region? And if you have other examples from other regions you want to bring in, I'd welcome that as well. Over to you, Anil Nikila.
Thank you very much, Evelyn. I think that is a very important point that you highlighted, which is on cooperation. I think that is something that even in the Pacific, that is something that we are really trying to look at in terms of enhancing our partnership across the region in terms of fulfilling our obligations for human rights. I think the fulfillment of our obligation relating to human rights is something that comes with political will. And I think that is very important when we look at it from that dimension on trying to ensure that that is something that we take into consideration when working on this. But as I've said earlier, in the discussions that we have been having, as you have, Dina, just in light of what Dina had mentioned in relation to human rights, as I've mentioned earlier, so this is something that is very central to the discussion in the Pacific because it's an existential threat. I think in the discussion on the establishment of the special rapporteur, I think this is one of the things that countries like the Marshall Islands have raised. What happens when they are no longer in existence? What happens to all their rights that they should bear in terms of them being states? And I think that is where the element of cooperation comes in. And I think that we are working on certain projects in the Pacific in terms of trying to look at some of the indicators that we have in the region that is important in terms of looking at how we will be affected in terms of us as countries and us in terms of fulfilling this obligation. I think Dina had touched on some of the projects that are going on in the Pacific, and that is very important from our side in terms of looking at the countries that are being piloted, in terms of understanding the dynamics of the challenges relating to climate change, and also in terms of looking at migration. I think that is something that the discussions that we need to have now is to look at our migration policy and how we look at migration policy and the need to consider new boundaries in terms of how do we work on cross-border in the region. For us in the Pacific, that's a very sensitive issue that we don't discuss because of the relationships that we have with our land. And whenever that subject is brought up, that is something that is very sensitive for the discussion. But we have all come to the agreement that that is the reality of the future, that in some point in time that we need to start that discussion. And I think Dina has mentioned that in terms of looking at it, in terms of how we cooperate as countries in the Pacific, and how we look at that in terms of the fulfillment of human rights, in terms of looking at something that we discussed earlier, in terms of looking at visa for cross-border in relation to climate change, and also in terms of looking at the policy and the practice that we do. I think for Fiji, that is something that we are working on with the countries in the region to look at this seriously in terms of the discussions that we are having. And I think by having the special rapporteur, it provides that importance, the leverage that we need for this to be discussed at that level. And I think that is something through the projects that we are doing in partnership with IOM, with PDD, we are beginning to look at the dynamics that we are facing as a country. And also something that was highlighted earlier in the one page that we have, and that is on data. That is very important to inform the practice that we do. And I think that is something that we are really working on in terms of understanding that context and having that data to support the work that we do in the much longer term over cooperation, and how do we look at our migration policy and how we adjust it to suit the context of the region. And I think that is definitely something that we will be working on in terms of other future collaborations within the PDD that we are looking at in the risk of, in the context of regional security. That is something that we are trying to look at with IOM, IDMC, and UHCR in terms of new frontiers that we can look at in terms of furthering the discussion, because this is very important. Although it's sensitive, but we need to bring all countries to the table, look at it holistically and in the reality of their own situation. And as a region such as the Pacific, we have something that is called the Framework for Resilient Development in the Pacific, which looks at disaster and climate change in the same lens, and also in terms of moving from that framework into much more concrete action to ensure that we are in the right place, we have the right policies across countries that we can have to ensure that we can support each other, and also in terms of having a regional framework on human mobility that we can all work on together to ensure that we can address the migration challenges of the future within the Pacific. Thank you very much, Evelyn. I think that is something on the angle of cooperation that we are working on as a region in terms of looking at the discussion on the issue around migration. I think from that, it will feed up to the IMRF in terms of looking at our contribution to that conversation, and also in terms of all those other compacts that will be coming up in terms of looking at something that Dina mentioned is on the climate angle of the discussions that we are having. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now we go to Ambassador Nazrul Islam from Bangladesh, which has an explicitly human rights-based policy to addressing disaster displacement. Now that's internal displacement, so maybe a little bit outside of your portfolio. But I just want to acknowledge that. You can speak to that or not. I think we have so many issues now with human rights on the table for you to address in the context of Bangladesh and or in the context of IGAD and the region where you are currently posted. So I turn it over to you, Nazrul Islam.
Thank you very much. As anticipated, the human rights aspect of migration has come up. I also mentioned during my first intervention that migration, we think, is a development and humanitarian issue. So human rights aspect is extremely important. After COP26, if you consider all the NDCs, you will see that even every country, if they stick strictly to their NDCs, still at the end of the century will not be able to keep the temperature within the 1.5 degrees centigrade. It will be at least 1.8 degrees centigrade. Still, it will cause devastation everywhere. So whether we like it or not, climate change is happening, and Dina mentioned that slow onset disasters are very important. Unfortunately, slow onset disasters are not very slow. If you read the last 3 IPCC reports, you will see that slow onset disasters are actually more or less just becoming fast. So we cannot wait. We cannot wait that the people will be aware and then we'll take action. So we must, whatever we want to do, we have to do it now. Bangladesh has been the chair of CBF. We were chair of PDD. And when we were in this position, we strongly moved this migration issue in the climate change and also the climate change issue in the migration. So we tried to do both. So what we have learned from our small experience is that first, to ensure human rights globally for the climate-induced migrants, first you have to implement the human rights in your own country. So that's why for policy making, whether it is in food security, whether it is in housing, whether it is in disaster management, everywhere you must consider the issue of climate-induced migration and displacement, because for them, they are very vulnerable, and this space must be provided in the policymaking in every sector. So that's how probably you will be able to first ensure human rights of the climate-induced migrants in your own country. When you can do that, then you can press for global recognition of human rights of the climate-induced migrants. And here we have found out that regional initiatives would be very important, because one country may not be very strong to drive ahead with a particular issue, but if you have a regional move, probably that may be more useful and beneficial. So this is one thing. And from Bangladesh, we also found out that climate change induced migration has very two simple aspects. First, to stop it, you have to stop climate change. And second is that those who have been adversely affected by climate change, those displaced or migrant community must be helped. These are two very simple aspects. So we have found out that private sector is very important. Often we actually, do not recognize or forget the role of the private sector, because all this climate change and other things are actually mostly caused by private sector. So they should be made aware of their role. So private sector must be brought into any future negotiation or discussion, and definitely policy making level must be considered in such a way that every sector, while we make policy, must have this consideration of these climate-induced migrants or climate displaced, climate change displaced migrants. So these are the two things. And also, I think that when we talk about human rights aspect, only if we actually move globally from different platforms. We have, Sendai framework, we have SDGs, we have UNFCCC, we have GCM, we have Global Compact on Refugees. So in every platform, and we have now IMRF, in every platform while we discuss, there should be a coherence, and we should drive the same issue in the same manner, so that our efforts are not lost. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Towards the end there, you got to what I was going to ask you to think about, a final question for a final comment after we go to everyone on the floor. And that is for all of you. We've been talking about climate-induced migration and climate-induced migrants, but we know that climate change is going to increase the number of people who need to move, make conditions more difficult for people who are moving, but also that it won't always be obvious who is the climate migrant or climate-induced migrant. So I'm going to come back to you at the end, and you can give your final thoughts. But one of the questions that I would invite you to reflect a little bit on is how climate change will be affecting migration, and what this means for implementing the GCM and or other agreements and policies you may want to mention. But I would now like to, with those very rich sets of reflections, I would like to go to the floor, inviting questions from participants. We have almost 200 of them. We could start with Raj Bardwi. Do you want to ask your question, or would you like for me to read it?
Okay, so thank you very much. I think, yeah, I'm having a very serious cold, and I don't know if I'm audible. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Thank you very much to the panelists, and of course the moderator for guiding the discussion. the issue of human rights is critical and is fundamental. And as Ambassador said, that we have to have this framework at the national level and the regional level before we can go to the international level. The question I had was, how do we ensure in the climate of anti-migration or politicization of migration, how do we ensure that there is that level of compassion in the countries that would be using this human rights angle to accommodate people who are desperate? And the point I have, I'm from the Caribbean. We have also serious issues, well, not so much. Some islands are below sea level, but the main challenge is that we have these earthquakes, and we have other kinds of related issues which require people to move. And that was the case with Hurricane Maria in 2018. What some people had to move, in fact, almost 30% of the population moved to the neighboring islands, which were not affected by this. So they were accommodated and they returned. But in the case of countries such as in the islands in Fiji, the nearest point for them would be New Zealand or Australia. Now, what will be the attitude? How would they ensure that these people who are desperate and they have to move and they need to be accommodated? So how do we, what sort of policy at the international level, regional, of course, national, regional, international level, need to be put in place to ensure that those who are really genuine and desperate are accommodated, their rights are respected? I mean, it's good to say human rights must be put in this and put in that. How do we ensure? How do we ensure? How do we create that sort of compassion among the receiving countries that these are needed people? And as you rightly said, how do we distinguish between economic migrants and environmental migrants, or for that matter, refugees and economic migrants? So these are very thorny and these are very, blurry things. So how in the final analysis, people who are in need will really get very seriously put aside? So, and there will be further disasters when people are not being cared for. What is going to happen to the population and so on? Thank you so much. Sorry, I have taken more than I should have. But thank you to the panelists for very rich contributions. And I'm so impressed that there is this regional framework in the context of Fiji, because that's what countries need to have, the regional framework, national framework, and then you move from there to the international level. Thank you so much, Evelyn, for giving me the floor. Thank you. Sorry, I'm nursing a cold. Thank you.
Thank you, Raj. Sorry to make you speak, but I'm glad that I didn't just read the little bit that you had put in the chat, because you framed the question really beautifully. And I think that the experience of COVID and border closures and lack of responding to what people in need when it comes to migrants, people who need to cross borders, is an example that we need to be considering as we move forward. I want to go to someone with their hand up. Aniti Basi, I cannot see your full name, so please excuse me. But please, if you will ask your question briefly, and then we will get answers from our panelists. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Anete Basi. I'm calling in from Nigeria. The last name is Alfonsia. It's too long for you to pronounce, so you can stop at Basi. I think so. What I want to ask, Raj has done justice to that question, but I want to push further. And I already talk about policy implementation, which is political. It says take political will to implement some of the policies. And my understanding from childhood is that there are little things, there are some certain things that we grow up with, which now make us very, very hard to change our will and patterns of reasoning. My question is, can we, as a matter of advocacy and IOM, try to push this thing down where school can implement it in their program, in their curriculum, and start to teach children on how to respect rights of migrants and how to respect environment, in cases that matters. Because I believe that kindergarten child that knows how to respect a visitor or that comes to his father's house will be able to respect some other person that visits his domain. And a child in primary school that knows how to take care of his own environment will be able to coordinate policies very well when he gets into government, when he gets into corridor of power on how to handle a good environment. That's my question.
Thank you very much. I think that's an important question for us all to keep in mind, and a way that civil society and migrants and people in government can all do well to keep in mind and to consider, and when they're in a position to implement. And it goes very well with Raj's question. So now we'll shake up the order a little bit further, if that's okay. Or perhaps I should ask which of you would like to go first in responding to Raj's questions and Mr. Basi's question as well. Or I could just pick on Anari. Is that okay?
Gentleman first.
Thank you, Evelyn. I think those are very relevant questions. But in terms of looking at the question that Raja raised, in terms of looking at the issues around migration, but I think one of the things that is very important that I mentioned earlier is the discussions that we need to have as a region, because as she rightly mentioned, we have 2 neighboring countries in Australia and New Zealand, which are part of the Pacific Island Forum. But at this stage, a lot of the discussion on how do we define migrants in terms of climate migrants and economic migrants, that is something that's still up for discussions. And I think it's very important that we discuss this with the receiving countries so that we are clear on how we categorize some of these migrants. Because at these stages, I've mentioned earlier, there is no general mandate on how we treat climate refugees, as you are all aware. That is why the work of the special rapporteur will be very important in terms of looking at the issues around migration. We know that Cecilia is working on IDPs, but that is a very separate discussion from how we want to take that discussion forward in terms of giving clear definition on some of the elements that I think that this Raja has just mentioned. It's very important that has to come from the human rights perspective. And that is something that we also need to have when we are discussing, as I've mentioned, it's something that we are discussing in the Pacific on climate change and migration security. I think that dovetails well with, that cannot progress if we don't have that clear categorization in terms of looking at the important discussion that we are having in relation to climate and migration. I think once we have that, then we can discuss that in terms of looking at it with receiving countries and how we adjust our migration policies to better reflect. I think, Raja, that will be work in progress. I think we will make concrete step probably in the next 2 to 3 years. I think there's a project that is coming up in the Pacific that is focusing on that element. And Fiji, as the chair for PDD, is also trying to provide technical advice with IOM in terms of how we understand all this from the perspective of the countries that will be affected, and how we can move together in terms of having clear definitions on how on certain characteristics of something that we have in the region. On the question by Mr. Bezi in terms of looking at inculcating this in the curriculum, I think that is something that is also being pursued across all countries globally in terms of inculcating some of the work on climate, on migration, on environment, and also with human rights in terms of the work that do, especially into the education system. I think in Fiji, we are right now trying to look at environment and climate change as an entry point. But I think it comes down to what context that we will try to bring this into the curriculum system, especially for those that are at a very young age. Because for us, from a cultural perspective, we come under the notion that everything starts at home, especially in the young ages, in terms of the role of parents in bringing up children. But I think in terms of the secondary level into tertiary level, as things begin to win out, I think that is where we need to solidify in terms of looking at the importance of understanding human rights and respecting it across migrants and all other important issues that we need to instill in children as they grow up into certain age, into adulthood. I think that is very important in terms of looking at it from that perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a great response. But since we already experience a lot of leadership from youth and a lot of foot dragging from older generations, unfortunately, especially from my region of the world and the global north broadly. So I am inviting our other two panelists to reflect on the question on how do we get regular pathways for those who need them? How do we get adequate regular pathways for those who need them? I don't know, I can see Dina on my screen. I'm hoping that, oh yes, Ambassador Islam is also there. So maybe Ambassador, will go to you first if you have a response to this question. And I will also invite further questions in the chat box or raised hands. Thank you.
Thank you, Evelyn. Frankly, I don't have a very black and white answer for this, but you mentioned GCM. GCM clearly identifies slow onset environmental degradation, natural disasters, and climate change impacts as drivers of contemporary migration. And also, GCM recognizes that climate change mitigation and adaptation measures in countries of origin need to be prioritized to minimize drivers of migration. So GCM already has some options, I mean, globally. So because GCM and through GCM, the member states, they agree that adaptation and mitigation should be prioritized in the countries of origin. That's how this should be helping the displaced population. And also, these are the drivers. I mean, slow onset disasters, natural disasters, climate change. These are the drivers of migration. It has also been accepted by the parties to GCM. And again, I would like to mention Para 12 of Global Compact on Refugees. Para 12 also says that external forced displacement may result from sudden onset natural disasters and environmental degradation. And it also says that the states may seek support from international community to address complex challenges that arise from such situations. So even a Global Compact on Refugees, they actually invite states, and it has been accepted by the parties that the states can seek global support in case of such emergencies. So theoretically, the scope is there at the international front, but how to go about it? I'll be very frank again that still cross-border migration is very sensitive in every region. So I'll not try to delve into something that is not very decided and secured in our discussion. So I will just try to say that if we at least try to get financial and other support for the displaced or endangered population caused by the climate change, at least this financial support can go a long way. This is one thing. And second thing is that if we move through locally led adaptation plan and locally led actions will also ensure integration and support, moral and other support to the affected population. So these things can be discussed through regional forum. These things can be help the affected population. I'm not talking about cross-border movement. Maybe, I don't know, probably at one point, not now, maybe after 30, 40, 50 years, maybe we'll have to discuss this, but still the time and ambience is not very helpful to discuss cross-border movement of population affected by the climate change. But in the meantime, what we can do definitely, but we can at least help them through increased financial support, increased, local, legal, and other logistics. So this can be done through regional and global initiatives. This is what I think we can do for the time being. And definitely in Bangladesh, using the curricula, we have been using migration issues in our curricula already, but we have not yet been successful in integrating climate-induced migration. But the migration so far is actually included in our curricula. So youths and even the children, they are aware of the migration issues, because Bangladesh is one of the top migrant exporting countries or labor migration dependent countries in the world. So we have already included these particular issues in our curricula, but definitely in future we will try to also include climate-induced migration, so that the climate-induced migrants, they get full recognition, honor, and security in the society. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And yes, I know there are many migrant workers from Bangladesh who are living and working in difficult conditions that will be impacted by climate change in countries that are particularly impacted by climate change. So that will be an issue. I hope that we don't have to wait 3 decades for progress on pathways for international migration, and we'll be interested in a final round what you may have to say about progress. Dina, do you want to make a quick comment here, or shall I go to a question?
No, I can just briefly say for the first question, I think it's such a huge question. It's about humanity, in fact. So how do we change humanity? That's if you look at this like huge question, you get scared. So I really think that there are so many things that can be done concretely. So for instance, I would say education, and that brings me to the second question. Education is key. The curriculum for young children, but also more curriculum for students. So education at home, education everywhere, education in gender equality. I haven't spoken about gender, and I really think we have to not forget that speaking of gender, it's men and women. So I believe we won't change anything for women if men are not brought in the discussion fully to change already this from the youngest age. I think stories, voices of people, art, all this can change, in fact, the way we perceive and advance the fact that we look at migration in its human dimension and not just cold or very political dimension. I also think that transforming all this discussion into concrete projects on the ground, it's part of making this change. I really believe that good research and data, correct data about populations that are vulnerable, that are exposed, but are not necessarily migrants, it's very important as well. So to stop alarmistic, transforming data and statistics into alarmistic and counterproductive, in fact, results. So I think there are so many things that can be done. So that's why I maintain a positive and hopeful attitude, because I think all this counts. And very concretely as well, one of the things that I also discussed in my new function, it's also the whole focus on giving much more visibility to the action of migrants and diasporas as actors of climate action. For very concrete, I think this is a game changer as well in the way we perceive migration and the narratives of migration. And then with the GCM, I think what matters most is this very comprehensive view that it's before, during, after migration. And once again, I find a bit ironic somehow for me, who over the past years, I've been trying desperately to showcase the importance of environmental and climate drivers. And then as a result, I think for the GCM, I really think that it's so difficult to isolate them from everything else, from poverty, from demography, from politics, from economy, that the responses have to be comprehensive. It doesn't mean denying the importance of these factors, and GCM recognizes them, but it means a broader vision of migration as part of the solution. So it's broader. The regular pathways means also labor migration, means also all this vision of fluidity of migration, and it's not necessarily about isolating at any rate these environmental, in fact, drivers at the end of the day. So I stop here.
Thank you. That was great, Dina, and you actually already got to the concluding question that I asked you to reflect on a little bit. So let's get a question from John Bingham, and if there are one or two others, and then assuming that our panelists can stay just a couple of minutes longer maybe, or if they can all be very quick, we'll get final thoughts in. So John, over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Evelyn, and thank you to the speakers. I'm John Bingham with the NGO Committee on Migration in New York, where we have a subcommittee focusing entirely on climate displacement and solutions. Evelyn Tennant actually is one of the leading lights there also. So Evelyn, fine job all around. Dina, thanks very much for what you've just said about humanity. How do we change humanity? And you started, and you finished by suggesting the importance of solutions. I think humanity likes solutions, and solutions like labor migration, like development, like people able to work, unite their families, and send earnings home to help with problems of climate and disaster and so on. Someone has a microphone on. Thank you. I think those solutions are important if we work harder at them and explain them better, including with decision makers. I have a question for you that echoes what Evelyn's been asking, but takes it maybe a step further. But before I ask the question, I just want to raise up Ambassador Nazrul Islam. You said this cannot just be a scientific issue. Thank you for starting us off that way. That's exactly how we have to start when we talk about mobility, or even the challenge people have about needing to move. Director Nikila, thank you very much for mentioning that really a concern we should share, that sometimes it might seem like civil society is competing with governments at all levels or several levels rather than partnering enough. That's absolutely something we should reflect more on. And Dina, again, back to you. I love the way you opened by saying you've just moved from working on climate in a human mobility organization to working on human mobility in a climate movement. So thank you for that, because that's where my question is on human mobility in these contexts. Evelyn raised the Global Compact for Migration, an inspiration and an initiative that first came from Bangladesh, we should remember. But the Global Compact referring to regular pathways. The Global Compact also refers to regularization, but it did not dare, or was not allowed to use the word regularization. But together with regular pathways, this idea to regularize people who have perhaps already moved in a regular status or have fallen into a regular status has enormous relevance for people who maybe can't get home because of climate disaster or environmental change. And we see that in several countries with solutions like, or at least pieces of solutions like, temporary protective status in the United States, or temporary suspension of removal in Canada. Now, before I started working at the international level, I worked on thousands and thousands of cases processing men, women, and children who were in irregular status in the United States, who could not go back to Nicaragua, Honduras, and El Salvador because of enormous climate disasters, storms and earthquakes, flooding, and so on. Haitians as well. And so those were part of solutions that enabled those people, first, to not be forced back into disaster type situations, second, to continue where they were and working, and able to send back earnings to support their families, communities, and countries. So here's the question, especially with respect to regular pathways and regularization, raising up human mobility in these conversations on climate and environmental change. In all kinds of migration, so many migrants ask, are we moving? Are we getting to where we need to get to? And are we moving quickly enough? It's the same thing in our advocacy and our work on solutions on these matters. Are we getting to where we need to get Diana, you mentioned so many different platforms, as did the ambassador and the deputy permanent representative of Fiji. Just as one example, here's the question. The Global Forum on Migration and Development, really the birthplace, thanks to Bangladesh, of the Global Compact for Migration, the birthplace for getting migrants and migration into the SDGs, thanks to Sweden and other governments. The Global Forum on Migration and Development in 2022 and 2023 is being chaired by France and Senegal together, with a focus on human mobility and climate. How do we in civil society, partnering with governments at all levels and other platforms, how do we use this moment effectively in a global forum that has not focused on human mobility and climate? It's one of the latecomers, but perhaps one of the powerful new arrivals on this issue. How do we organize together to make sure that issue is deep and wide and practical enough? And if I may say so to close, and Fiji, maybe Fiji is part of the answer if you would step up to chair the Global Forum in 2024. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Okay, we have just 2 minutes in our official time slot, but I'm hoping that none of our panelists will have to leave and I can get an answer from each of you. I will start with Ambassador Islam. Quick answer to John's question and any other concluding thought, overall reflection, or just one thing that we could implement going forward. What do you want to leave us with, sir?
Thank you, John, for your remarks and also your question. You had always been a very strong supporter and friend of all the initiative of Bangladesh. GFMD has always been a very strong platform outside of UN. So the main, as we understood in Bangladesh, that the main reason of having GFMD is that out of UN and other government negotiation positions, people can go to GFMD and speak out their ideas themselves without any fear or any distribution from any other side, because it's not a global negotiation forum. So this is more or less of an informal forum to share the advanced thoughts on migration and movement of migrants. So that's why I think GFMD is a very useful platform to share the thoughts which we cannot actually say at UN or in any other government platform. So this is one thing. This is the advantage of GFMD. So that's why we think that we can use GFMD to integrate the efforts of the CSOs, even and the government, because the government has a lot of limitations. So, but at GFMD, because I was in GFMD in Ecuador 2 years ago with my foreign minister. So I could write a lot of things or include a lot of things in his speech, which I could not do when he was speaking at UN or at any other bilateral meeting. So this is how it might be useful to spread out the ideas, or at least idealistic ideas about migration, which we cannot share elsewhere. And through CSOs, look, I mean, normal or general population can be aware of these requirements, can be aware of the dignity and honor of the climate-induced migrants, which may be officially at the global level, the government may not be able to implement or may not even able to raise. So that's how GFMD is a very good platform. And through active interaction and engagement with CSOs, the government can actually channel out their thoughts and ideas to the CSOs for informal implementation among the population. This is how I still see about GFMD. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And now we will go to the Deputy Permanent Representative, Mr. Anil Nikila. We will not put you on the spot as to whether whether Fiji will chair the GFMD, but it certainly is a good thing to think about. Your concluding thoughts, sir.
Well, thank you, Evelyn, and thank you, John, for sharing your insights there and in the conclusion of this discussion. And I agree with the Ambassador Nazrul in terms of the experience of CSOs in terms of the work that you do. And I readily agree that that is something that needs to be highlighted given the limitations within government in implementation, and something that goes back to the discussion earlier on the political dynamics of the work on trying to address migration. But I think it's also worthwhile to note that particular experience across all key actors of this important work. And I hopefully that there'll be an avenue for you to raise your views in terms of the discussion to ensure that the work that we do in GCM and also in the GFMD is holistic enough in terms of looking at the progress and what is the way forward for the future in terms of looking at the lessons learned in terms of the implementation thus far. So in terms of that, that is all, Evelyn, but in terms of your question, John, on Fiji there in 2024, who knows what the future holds, but I cannot promise you that that is something that we look to. But if that is something that we might also need to consider moving forward in the future to ensure cross-regional representation in terms of the work that we do on this very important subject matter. Thank you very much, Evelyn. I think you are muted, Evelyn.
Thank you. And thank you so much for your participation, both of you. And now quickly to Dina for thoughts on the GFMD and the use of the GFMD in furthering a holistic and cross-silo approach, as well as any other concluding thought quickly.
Yeah.
Because we're a little over. Thanks.
Yes, we are over time, I would say. I mean, for me, GFMD, I was in the team in IOM who worked on the first conference that led to the establishment of the GFMD. So it's close to my heart. I must say, John, I don't agree. GFMD has worked on climate change and migration, in particular under the Moroccan presidency, where we had a full session on climate change and migration, but it's time to go one step further. From my side, what I would conclude, it's more the vision about migration policy in our contemporary world in a way, because until now, migration policy and discussions at multilateral level have advanced through dialogues. We have the model of international dialogue of migration of IOM, 20 years now, celebrated it. You have the example of soft law and agreement among countries that are interested, the model of the Bern Initiative in 2003 and the International Agenda on Migration, the model of the Platform on Disaster Displacement of Nansen Initiative. You have all the model of the consultative processes at regional level that are advancing, in fact, reflection on migration policy. And then in 2018, we changed a bit by having the Global Compact on Migration and the Global Compact on Refugees. So I really wonder in a way whether, because GFMD continues on the model of dialogues and exchanges of practices and learning from each other and bringing in the civil society. And now we have the work stream on migration and climate change under the UN Network on Migration that also strives to bring in stakeholders. And I really find that in a way we are always still saying it's not enough. It's not enough to be just in dialogues and multilateral discussions. It's not enough to have the GCM and the network. We would want things that commit countries. And I just end on this, that maybe we are not necessarily there, or maybe it's not necessarily happening. I think it's happening at bilateral level, at national level. And if you have the example of the EU also working on climate change and displacement, you have the US and the White House that did a major consultation and just produced a document on climate change and migration. We have so many countries that are putting it commitments in their national adaptation plan. So you have very many changes in the way that countries deal with this topic, but we are still, I think, in migration on multilateralism that goes through dialogues, and we should make maybe the most of that and contribute the most possible through these mechanisms. And maybe a new stage in international governance of migration will come with much more processes that commit countries to negotiate. But we are not yet there. And that's why, for instance, we worked for many years to bring migration into the climate negotiations, because that's where states were negotiating. But now we are unhappy that it's too slow, it's too processy, it's too not enough action oriented. And we are complaining on the migration side that we're still in the dialogue side and not there, maybe having such a process that commits. And so for me, that's my last word. I would say just let's make the most of what we have, and through mechanisms where we actually include people, and in particular include migrants. So I encourage you all to follow also the work of the Climate Vulnerable Forum in this direction towards the Global Compact, towards IMRF, and towards GFMD, because there will be strong highlight on the contribution of migrants to climate action. And that will be also connected to the work of other international organizations, of the UN Network on Migration and of UNFCCC. So from my side, I conclude on this, looking ahead positively about this also initiative that aims really to change a bit the narrative about migration. And thank you again for this opportunity and wonderful questions and sharing such a panel. It's really an honor for me.
Thank you so much, Dina. Thank you to all our panelists. You have been excellent, really good orientation to key issues. I hope that we get to have another conversation soon where we discuss some of the really practical issues, because I think there are ways now, both in climate, in the adaptation, and in the loss and damage kind of pillars where action can be taken at national level. We need to have those discussions and get really concrete. And then there is also, there are also going to be ways to get concrete at the national and regional level through the GCM. So we definitely have to keep talking to all of you and see what the options are. I'm sorry I was taken aback at the beginning. I didn't realize I was doing the initial introduction and I didn't introduce myself. I'm one of the steering group members and one of the originators of the Climate Migration and Displacement Platform. We were created during the negotiations of the GCM, but also include a lot of people from climate justice, climate action, humanitarian, and DRR. And we will be having a variety of events coming up in the new year that hopefully will enable us to get further into some of these issues. And I think that we're also hoping for one more round of the People's Migration Challenge in the new year, leading up to the IMRF, where we will maybe bring some of that in. I encourage those of you interested in the IMRF process to look at the events that are coming up, including those through the UN network in the new year. And then I really encouraged you, even though this year we don't have a dedicated session for climate change and migration, to participate in the upcoming December 17th, as I said, going into December 18th, depending on your time zone, International Migrants Day event, online event, that is part of the broader People's Migration Challenge. We'll have a session in the middle where Gervais Apav will talk about regular pathways being the keystone to GCM implementation. I know that at least one of the respondents from the Pacific region will be specifically connecting that to the current situation of the climate crisis and the need to address the climate crisis in migration policy. So if there aren't any other messages that I've forgotten, I apologize to our panelists for keeping you over time, but I'm so glad that you have stayed for the entire time and offered so much food for thought and also specifics for us to keep in mind. Dina, welcome. We're very happy to be working with you in your new role. Thank you all so much.
Thank you to everyone.
All right.
Thank you and bravo for your big initiative. Really excellent. Bravo.
Thank you, Evelyn.
Thank you all and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you. Thank you.
C'est ça.